Project 2025, a policy blueprint from the Heritage Foundation and other conservative organizations, proposes sweeping changes to U.S. governance, aiming to consolidate executive power, reconfigure federal agencies, and reshape key policies across multiple domains. If enacted as described, it would significantly alter the United States in the following areas. Human rights. The plan emphasizes curtailing policies related to gender equity, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial equity. It calls for rolling back what it describes as radical gender and racial initiatives and reducing workplace diversity programs. Critics argue that these changes could erode protections for marginalized groups and reduce civil liberties 6-7 source, 9 source. Immigration. Project 2025 envisions stricter immigration policies, including the elimination of certain visa programs and a broader enforcement mechanism to secure borders. It seeks to restructure the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, prioritizing border security and interior enforcement over humanitarian or asylum-related processes, 7 source, 8 source. Economy. The plan favors deregulation, tax cuts, and support for fossil fuel industries. It seeks to significantly reduce environmental regulations, including altering the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, to minimize judicial oversight. Project 2025 also calls for decreasing government involvement in renewable energy programs and scaling back labor protections, 6 source, 8 source. Balance of powers. A key feature of Project 2025 is its endorsement of the unitary executive theory, which advocates for centralized presidential control over the executive branch. It includes proposals to reclassify tens of thousands of civil service positions into political appointees, ensuring agency staff loyalty to the president. This shift could undermine the traditional checks and balances by weakening the independence of federal agencies. The project aims to enhance executive power, enabling the president to exert greater influence over policymaking and agency operations. It includes measures to streamline or eliminate regulatory processes, restrict judicial review of executive actions, and reduce the role of career civil servants in policymaking, 8 source, 9 source. Critics argue that the proposed changes could undermine the rule of law by reducing oversight and accountability mechanisms. The plan would restructure the Department of Justice, DOJ, and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, which could politicize law enforcement and litigation decisions, source, 8 source. Constitution. The plan seeks to reinterpret the Constitution in line with conservative values, particularly regarding executive authority and federalism. Proposals include dismantling the Department of Education to enhance state and local control over education and promoting policies aligned with conservative Christian values. Critics worry these changes could challenge established constitutional principles, such as the separation of church and state, 7 source. Sanahasha, potential impacts. Supporters argue Project 2025 would restore self-governance by dismantling bureaucracy and aligning government policies with conservative ideals. Detractors, however, warn it could centralize power, erode civil liberties, and weaken institutional checks and balances, pushing the U.S. toward autocracy, 7-8 source. For the full text and detailed analysis, refer to sources like the Heritage Foundation's project site and analyses from legal experts and policy critics, 7 source, 8, 9 source. For Donald Trump to fully enact the proposals outlined in Project 2025, he would need to overcome significant political, legal, and logistical obstacles. Here's an analysis of the means to implement it and the barriers he could face. Means of implementation. 1. Executive orders. Trump could use executive orders to bypass legislative gridlock, particularly for reassigning agency functions or reversing existing policies. However, this method has limitations and could face judicial challenges. 2. Legislative support. A Republican-controlled Congress would be critical for enacting legislation required to restructure federal agencies or reallocate funds. This includes disbanding departments like the Department of Education and codifying changes to the federal workforce. 3. Civil service reclassification. Utilizing executive authority, Trump could reclassify civil servants as political appointees under Schedule F, as proposed in Project 2025. This move would enable him to replace tens of thousands of federal employees with loyalists aligned with his administration's agenda. 4. Judicial appointments. Expanding the number of conservative judges in federal courts could help ensure legal support for controversial policies and reduce the likelihood of judicial blocks. 5. Rulemaking and regulatory changes. The administration could leverage federal rulemaking to reshape regulations governing immigration, the environment, healthcare, and other areas. 6. Budget control and defunding. Redirecting or withholding federal funding from programs and agencies targeted for dismantling or restructuring. Obstacles to implementation. 1. Congressional resistance. A divided or Democrat-controlled Congress could block legislation critical to implementing many Project 2025 proposals, particularly the restructuring or elimination of federal departments. 2. Judicial review. Courts, including the Supreme Court, may strike down policies seen as overreach or violations of constitutional protections. For example, judicial rulings could limit the president's ability to dismiss civil servants en masse. 3. Public backlash. Drastic changes to civil rights protections, immigration enforcement, or environmental policies could spark widespread protests, galvanizing opposition from advocacy groups, state governments, and the public. 4. State governments. Resistance from state governments, especially on education and healthcare policies, could hinder implementation at the local level. 5. Bureaucratic resistance. Career civil servants, unions, and advocacy groups could resist significant changes to federal employment practices, delaying or obstructing reforms. 6. Legal and constitutional challenges. Proposals to consolidate executive power under the unitary executive theory could face accusations of violating the separation of powers, the rule of law, and civil liberties. 7. International repercussions. Changes to immigration policies and foreign relations strategies could provoke responses from other countries, complicating their enactment and implementation. Key dependencies. Success would depend heavily on unified Republican control of the federal government, Congress and the presidency, and a judiciary favorable to conservative priorities. Without these conditions, the scope of Project 2025's enactment could be significantly curtailed. For further detailed insights into Project 2025, its policy blueprint, and implementation challenges, you may consult the Heritage Foundation's Documents 7 and critical analyses available through legal and political scholars. Origins and key figures of Project 2025. Project 2025 was created by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, to serve as a comprehensive policy guide for a future Republican presidential administration. It is based on their long-running Mandate for Leadership series, first published during the Reagan era in 1981, which provides detailed conservative policy blueprints for governance 6-source, 8-source, 9-source. Contributors to Project 2025. The 2025 initiative brings together more than 400 contributors, including policy experts, former Trump administration officials, and conservative activists. Prominent contributors and editors include Paul Dans, director of Project 2025 and a former official in the Trump administration. Stephen Groves, Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, involved in editing the report. Christopher Miller, former acting Secretary of Defense under Trump, contributed to the Department of Defense section. Ken Cuccinelli, former acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, contributed to the DHS chapter. Roger Severino, former head of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services, contributed to health policy sections. Lindsay M. Burke, Heritage Foundation's education policy expert, contributed to the Department of Education restructuring chapter 7-source, 8-source, 9-source. The plan involved input from individuals with direct experience in the Trump administration and broader conservative movement networks, connections to Donald Trump, The project's creators and contributors have significant associations with Donald Trump. 1. Policy and ideological alignment. Many contributors are former Trump appointees or advisors who played key roles in shaping his administration's policies, particularly on immigration, deregulation, and education. Their inclusion reflects alignment with Trump's America First agenda. 2. Advancing Trump's goals. The proposals explicitly support ideas tied to Trump's rhetoric, such as expanding executive authority, dismantling the deep state, and prioritizing loyalty among federal appointees. 3. Preparation for 2025. While the Heritage Foundation maintains that the project is for any conservative president, Trump has the most direct association with the policies due to the significant number of former officials involved and the alignment with his second-term goals. 7 Sat source, 9 source. Shash criticisms and implications. Critics argue that the alignment with Trump and the inclusion of former officials signal a push to create a centralized executive government under his leadership, reinforcing concerns about undermining checks and balances. Opponents also highlight the Christian nationalist underpinnings of some proposals. 6 source, 8 source. For further details, the full list of contributors and specific chapters can be found in the Heritage Foundation's publication, Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise, available on their official site, hwww.heritage.org/project25.